This podcast is proudly brought to you by Treasury One, South Africa's leading treasury solutions company that unlocks financial value for your business. Take advantage of the strong rand by moving as much money as you can offshore to diversify your investment portfolio. That's the message from Andre Salier, currency strategist at Treasury One, who joins me, Jackie Cameron, for this week's BizNews Currency Focus.
It's simple. The story is supply and demand. There's more sellers than buyers. The commodity space are continuing with good figures. The Federal Reserve, we've alluded to this before, is still continuing with the same old story. We will not change short-term interest rates. We will continue. The non-farm payrolls once again disappointed on Friday afternoon, once again was lower than what was expected. And I think the biggest disappointment on Friday was not really that the non-farm payrolls missed the objective target of 650, but that the revised figures for the previous month was only increased, because you must remember the figures that comes out or that came out on Friday is the expected figure for May. The revised figure that comes out when the expected figure for June comes out in the beginning of July, then they revise the figure for May to the actual one. Now, the actual one that was revised for April was only increased by a dismal 12,000 people. So not only did we miss the targets, the revised figure was also disappointing. And that actually simply tells us that maybe, just maybe, the significant growth and fantastic growth that was expected out of the US economy is not as fantastic as was generally expected, and it might take a little bit longer for the economy to really show that growth. And in the meantime, then everybody says, okay, well, if there's not going to be any movement in interest rates in the short term in the United States, and the commodity space is still doing well, and we can still get relatively good yields in the emerging market space, then people are going to move dollars over and currencies over to the emerging market space, and then once again linked to a commodity space that's still doing well. There you have it. There's more dollars flowing in, there's more currency flowing in, and not enough people to buy that currency, and hence the currency strengthens. And that's going to be the story. As long as that continues, that's going to be the story, and then the rand can benefit.
Reuters reported at the start of this week that offshore investors bought a net of 513 million rand of South African stocks last week, and they also bought more than R1 billion worth of bonds. Does this play into the strengthening of the rand?
That's absolutely what I've just said. You know, there's the inflow into the bond market, there's an inflow into the equity market, and that's on financial transaction flows. And on the trade flows, as I've spoken now about commodity prices and so forth, there's also more sellers. We expect a huge trade surplus once again when it gets released. So you take trade figures, positive inflow. Capital inflows in terms of bond and equity, positive inflows, and just not enough buyers. The import side is just too little to sweep up all that surplus of dollars, surplus of currency coming in, and not even the Reserve Bank can rein that fast enough. But we must remember that if the Reserve Bank were to buy all those surplus dollars, it would bode well for our reserves, because our reserves would be built up tremendously. But at the same time, for every $1 million that they buy out of the market to build up the reserves, they would have to put in the equivalent of almost 13.5 billion rand. If they buy $1 billion, they'll put in 13.5 billion rands into the money markets. Then they would have to go with repo transactions to negate that again, because if you just continuously buy up the reserves, put money into the market, there would be too much liquidity in the rand market, and that would be dropping interest rates to levels that's too low. So the actions needed from the central bank would be on both ends. It would be build up your reserves from the surplus of currency, but also do reverse repos to get some of the money out of the money market again to avoid interest rates going too low. You just cannot. I mean, there's just too many fronts to stop, and that's why the rand continues to benefit.
So do you see this continuing for the rest of the year? What do you think is going to happen to the rand?
Well, I think that the rand can benefit going forward as well, because we've heard this morning that more banks are coming out with good results. The mining houses having good results. And I think I've said this before, Mr. Mboweni gets a smile on his face because his tax revenue is going to be better. If his tax revenue is going to be better, then he needs to borrow a little bit less. Then he'll be overshooting his targets that were set. The one thing that he still needs to do, and that's a bit of a question mark that lies above his head at the moment, is how firm can he be on the salary increases for state employees? But if he can stand firm on that and keep his fiscal expenditure in, within reason and within the parameters set, which he seems to be set on, and then if his tax income is better and his borrowings is a little bit lower, then he's going to be able to do a very nice medium-term budget speech at the end of the year. I do not see that the commodity area will decline massively over the next 2 quarters. I don't think that interest rates would move in the US or in South Africa over the next 2 quarters. So all the positives that we speak about is going to be prevailing. Added to that, a medium-term budget speech that I think will be better comes October, then we can, throughout the rest of the year, still see some positiveness on the currency. I do think that it's getting a little bit overheated and a little bit too much, but the market tells me and the supply and demand tells me that it will continue.
If it looks a little bit overheated now, might be a good time to take as much as possible offshore if you're thinking of investing elsewhere.
It is a fantastic time to diversify your investment portfolio, get some of your funds offshore. Take the opportunity now, to try and wait for a turning point and to sit here and think that the turning points are going to be at 12.90 or 13.05, to try and wait for that turning point. You might just miss the opportunity. Diversify whilst you're getting good value. Do it continuously, do it little bit by little bit, but do it. Do not sit back and let these wonderful opportunities that prevail in the market at the moment slip past your ability to take your money offshore. Take some of it offshore, make damn sure that you do it at these levels. And even if you have taken money at the 16 and 17 level, don't do nothing now. Continue doing it. Because if you continue doing it, you're lowering your average rate at which you did it, which simply means that your break-even point on the currency front would be a lot sooner. So don't stop at all. Continue diversifying by re-evaluating everything and putting some of your money offshore.
Former Finance Minister Trevor Manuel told the International Monetary Fund in quite a hard-hitting article on their website that one of the major things holding back South Africa is, in fact, our very well-paid public servants. And you mentioned earlier this concept of will Tito Mboweni manage to keep the wage bill under control. Do you think that he's got enough political clout behind him to actually do something about this problem that is really weighing down the whole economy?
I think he's got enough political clout behind him to steer that one and avoid massive increases. What works against him is if our state president signs off on a 2.8% increase for MPs and then making the statement that MPs earning more than R1 million a year is actually suffering. For Pete's sake, if R1 million a year employee suffers, what are we going to say about the teachers that gets 300,000? What are we going to say about the nurses that most probably get even less? Why should they accept 1.5% if you can give the R1 million employee 2.8%? That is a problem. And that sort of works a little bit against Mr. Mboweni and in favor of the hands of the unions.
There's been a lot of talk about purchasing power parity this week. Do you pay attention to that at all when you size up the value of the rand?
Yes, we do. That's a very important one. But the one thing that one wants to keep in mind when you look at power parity is that it can stay in overvalued or undervalued situations for long periods of time. It's not to say that if the rand is an overvalued period, that it needs to correct immediately. It can stay in an overvalued period for a year or two, even longer. So simply being overvalued or undervalued does not say that it needs to correct immediately. It can take quite a long time. All you can say is it will eventually tend to turn back towards the 100 baseline. We are now reaching levels where I think we are at the 100 level. It's always debatable whether it's 1340, 1360, whatever. I think we're close to the purchase buying parity levels. Too much lower on the rand, too much stronger, places it in overvalued territory. Too much weaker would place it in an undervalued situation. So I think we're more or less correctly priced. But it can stay at these levels very, very long. It's not a short-term thing.
You've been listening to Andre Cillier, currency strategist at Treasury One. I'm Jackie Cameron for Biz News. This podcast was proudly brought to you by Treasury One, South Africa's leading treasury solutions company that unlocks financial value for your business.